There is a particular kind of story that history rarely produces, one where the ending keeps refusing to arrive. Empires collapse, dynasties crumble, civilizations that seemed immovable dissolve into dust and scholarly argument within a generation or two. That is the ordinary rhythm of power across the centuries, and most of us have absorbed it so completely that we treat decline and fall as something close to a natural law. But every so often, a civilization appears that simply will not follow the script. That looks at the precipice, stares down into the long darkness below, and then steps back and rebuilds. Not once, not twice, but across 11 full centuries of pressure that would have extinguished anything less deeply rooted. The Byzantine Empire was that civilization, an empire that everyone agreed had fallen, that historians had written the obituary for in advance, that faced plague and invasion and theological civil war and betrayal from its closest allies, and still, stubbornly, magnificently, refused to stop existing. Tonight, that is the story we are settling into. Dim the lights if you have not already. Let your shoulders drop. This is going to take a while, and it is absolutely worth it. The city that became the heart of Byzantium was chosen with the instinct of someone who understood geography the way other people understand language. Constantine, the Roman emperor who would give the city his name, stood on a narrow finger of land jutting out into the water where Europe and Asia pressed closest together, where the Black Sea narrowed into the Bosphorus Strait, and the Bosphorus opened into the Sea of Marmara, and the Sea of Marmara reached toward the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean beyond. He would have understood immediately what the sight meant. Water on 3 sides, a natural harbour on the 4th, a sheltered inlet the Greeks had long called the Golden Horn, hills rising behind the water to give defenders the advantage of height, a position commanding the single most important maritime choke point in the known world. Every ship moving between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had to pass through the Bosphorus. Every army marching between Europe and Asia had to either cross the strait or go around it, which in practical terms meant going around the entire Black Sea. A journey of thousands of miles. Whoever held this city held the key to 2 continents. That was not metaphor. That was geography. And geography in the ancient world was destiny. The founding of Constantinople in the year 330 was not, in Constantine's mind, the founding of something new. It was the refounding of something old. Rome itself. He called his new capital Nova Roma. New Rome, though the name that actually stuck was the one the inhabitants used informally from the very beginning, Constantinople. The city of Constantine. The men and women who would live there across the following 11 centuries called themselves Romans without hesitation or irony. They spoke Greek as their everyday language, worshipped according to the forms of Christian theology that had developed in the Eastern Mediterranean, and governed according to traditions that had drifted considerably from anything Augustus would have recognized. But Roman they were. That identity was not performance or delusion. It was the central organizing fact of their civilization, the thread that held everything together across centuries of transformation so radical that almost nothing else remained constant. We call them Byzantine because a German historian named Hieronymus Wolff coined that term in the 16th century, borrowing it from the ancient Greek name for the settlement that had stood on the site before Constantine built over it. The Byzantines themselves would have found the label baffling. They had a word for their empire, Romania, and a word for themselves, Romaioi, Romans. That distinction, between what they called themselves and what later history decided to call them, matters more than it might initially seem. It is the difference between understanding them as the last chapter of something ancient and understanding them as something genuinely new. A civilization that remade itself continuously while insisting it had never changed at all. That tension is the engine of everything that follows. What made Constantinople's location even more extraordinary was the combination of its defensibility with its commercial potential. The Golden Horn formed one of the finest natural harbours in the world, deep, sheltered, and capable of accommodating fleets of a size that open coastal anchorages could never safely hold. The hills behind the city gave its defenders elevation and sightlines across every approach. The peninsula itself meant that any attacking army by land faced a single narrow front, rather than the exposure of an open plain. Constantine did not simply choose a beautiful or convenient location. He chose the one place in the known world where controlling a city meant controlling the movement of goods, armies, and ideas between East and West simultaneously. Later centuries would prove the wisdom of that choice in ways he could not have fully anticipated. As siege after siege broke against the city's walls while the wealth of two continents continued flowing through its markets, the city was, from its very first day, a wager on geography, and for 11 centuries, geography paid out generously on that bet. That is where this story begins, not with a battle or a coronation or a theological dispute, but with a man standing on a promontory above the water, looking east and west at the same moment, and understanding that whoever commanded this ground commanded the world. The Roman Empire that Constantine inherited was not the confident, expanding colossus of Augustus's era. It was something considerably more battered, a civilization that had spent the better part of a century tearing itself apart from within, while external pressure built steadily against every frontier simultaneously. To understand why a new capital on the Bosphorus felt not just logical but urgent, you have to sit with the scale of what the 3rd century had done to Rome. Between the years 235 and 284, the empire came closer to complete dissolution than at any point in its history. Historians call this period the crisis of the 3rd century, and the label requires no dramatic justification. In those 50 years, roughly 50 men claimed the title of emperor. Most of them died violently. Large portions of the empire operated under breakaway governments for extended periods. The Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, functioning as independent states while the centre convulsed. The currency was debased to near worthlessness as emperors printed money to pay soldiers who promptly used it to fund the next revolt. Trade networks contracted. Cities that had stood open and confident for generations hastily constructed walls around themselves. A physical expression of a psychological collapse that touched every corner of the Roman world. The elaborate administrative machinery that had governed 3 continents began to seize and grind, and the people living inside it had every reason to believe that the whole structure was simply going to come apart. Diocletian, who seized power in 284 and ruled for 20 years with a disciplined ferocity that the situation demanded, stabilized the situation through sheer administrative will. His solution to the problem of governing an empire too large for one man to manage was to formalize what had already been happening informally for decades. He divided imperial authority among 4 rulers, 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior emperors called Caesars, an arrangement known as the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. It was a practical response to real geography. An emperor in the west could respond to crises on the Rhine and in Britain without waiting for orders to travel thousands of miles from a court in the east. An emperor in the east could manage the Persian frontier and the Danube without neglecting the armies on the other side of the Aegean. The genius of the arrangement was its acknowledgement of something that Roman imperial ideology had always resisted admitting, that no single human being, however capable, could be everywhere the empire needed him to be at once. Diocletian himself ruled from Nicomedia in northwestern Anatolia rather than from Rome, a choice that signalled something important about where the real weight of the empire had shifted. The city of Rome remained symbolically central, draped in centuries of legend and marble, but it was no longer where decisions got made. Power had been moving east for a generation, following the money and the strategic reality, and Diocletian simply made that movement official by planting his court in the east and governing from there with visible effectiveness. Constantine inherited this divided world and then reassembled it through a series of civil wars that left him sole emperor by 324. His rivals fell one by one. Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge in 312, Licinius in the east a decade later, until only one man remained standing over the ruins of the Tetrarchy. His decision 6 years later to build a new capital on the Bosphorus was the culmination of a shift that had been developing across generations. The East was simply richer than the West, and richer in ways that compounded upon themselves. The eastern provinces had always been more densely populated, more urbanized, more commercially active, more deeply integrated into the long-distance trading networks that connected the Mediterranean world to Persia, India, and beyond. Egypt alone produced enough grain to feed enormous populations across the empire. Syria and Asia Minor were centers of manufacturing and skilled craftsmanship whose output moved through markets from Britain to Mesopotamia. The Greek-speaking cities of the eastern Mediterranean had been the intellectual heart of the Roman world for centuries, producing the philosophers and physicians and engineers whose work the Latin-speaking West absorbed and applied. Moving the capital east was not abandoning Rome. It was following the population, the productivity, and the strategic logic that 3 centuries of experience had made undeniable, building a new city from scratch rather than moving into one of the existing eastern capitals. Antioch, or Alexandria, or Nicomedia, each of which had its own entrenched interests and historical associations, allowed Constantine to design a centre of power that bore his own stamp entirely. There would be no competing memories in Constantinople, no ancient families whose roots in the city predated his own authority, no temples to gods whose worship clashed with the Christian identity he was increasingly projecting onto the empire. The blank promontory above the Bosphorus was an invitation to invention, and Constantine accepted it with the energy of a man who understood that the physical shape of a capital communicates something essential about the civilization it governs. What he built there, and what his successors would continue building for the next 11 centuries, was a statement about permanence delivered in stone and gold and water. The empire that had nearly dissolved in the chaos of the 3rd century was not going to dissolve again. It had found its ground. It had built its city, and the city, as generations of attackers would discover to their considerable frustration, was very nearly impossible to take. What Constantine actually built on that promontory above the Bosphorus was, in its deliberate architecture of reference and echo, an act of political theatre as much as urban planning. He modelled the new city on Rome in ways that were meant to be immediately legible to anyone who had ever walked the streets of the old capital. Constantinople had 7 hills. Like Rome, it had a forum at its centre. Like Rome, it had a senate, a circus for chariot racing, public baths, triumphal columns, and neighbourhoods laid out along the same organisational principles that centuries of Roman urban development had established as the natural grammar of imperial space. Constantine stripped statues and artworks from cities across the empire to decorate his new capital. Bronze figures hauled from temples in Athens and Delphi and Corinth. Marble portraits relocated from Alexandria and Antioch. Ancient works whose presence in the new city announced that Constantinople was not merely imitating the old world, but absorbing it, drawing its accumulated prestige into a new centre of gravity. The effect was something between a museum and a declaration of inheritance. Every stolen statue, every relocated column said the same thing, everything that Rome had been. Constantinople now was, the past had moved east, and it had done so willingly. The building that most vividly captured the social logic of the new city was the Hippodrome. Constructed directly adjacent to the imperial palace complex, so that the royal family could watch the chariot races from a private box connected directly to the throne room. That detail of physical architecture tells you almost everything you need to know about how Byzantine political culture understood the relationship between ruler and ruled. The emperor could observe his people at their most unguarded, in the grip of collective excitement and communal emotion, while remaining physically separated from the crowd by the thickness of a palace wall. The Hippodrome would become the social centre of Constantinople's public life for the next 8 centuries, the place where tens of thousands of citizens gathered to watch racing, to cheer for their favoured teams, to demonstrate loyalty to the emperor, and occasionally to riot with a ferocity that shook the throne itself. The two great racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, organised neighbourhood life, provided mutual aid to their members, and served as the primary mechanism through which public opinion communicated itself upward to the imperial court in a political system where organised opposition to the emperor was otherwise structurally impossible. The hippodrome was not simply entertainment, it was politics conducted by other means. And every emperor who sat in the kathisma watching the races understood that the noise rising from the crowd below was information he could not afford to ignore. Constantine also built churches, many churches, and his relationship to Christianity remains one of the most genuinely contested questions in late antique history. Whether he was a sincere convert, transformed by his vision before the Milvian Bridge, or a supremely pragmatic politician who recognized the organizational and ideological utility of a rapidly growing universal faith, is a question his own behavior never quite settles. Probably both are true in proportions that varied depending on the moment and the political pressure of the day. What is certain is that his Edict of Milan in 313, issued jointly with his co-emperor Licinius, ended the official persecution of Christians throughout the empire and returned confiscated church property. And the city he built on the Bosphorus was, from its very beginning, a Christian city in ways that Rome, with its ancient pagan temples and deeply embedded traditional religion, could never quite be. Constantinople had no competing religious past. Its sacred architecture was Christian from the ground up, and that absence of religious ambiguity gave the new capital a theological clarity that the old one, with its centuries of polytheistic accumulation, could not match. When Constantine died in 337, he was baptized on his deathbed, a timing that strikes modern observers as suspiciously convenient, but that made complete sense within a theological framework that treated baptism as the washing away of all prior sins. Whatever his private convictions had been across a lifetime of warfare and political calculation, he died as he had wanted to be remembered, a Christian emperor, the first of a line that would stretch across 11 centuries. The religious dimension of the empire's early centuries was not merely devotional, it was explosive. The argument over Arianism, the theological position holding that Christ was a created being, subordinate to God the Father, rather than co-equal with him, divided the church and the imperial court simultaneously for decades after Constantine's death. His 3 sons divided the empire among themselves and then fought over the pieces, and the theological disputes ran through their civil wars like a second current of violence. Theodosius I, who ruled as sole emperor from 379 to 395, finally made Orthodox Nicene Christianity not merely the favoured but the legally mandated religion of the Roman state. Pagan sacrifice was prohibited. Heresy became a crime. The great temples of the ancient world were closed, repurposed, or destroyed with a thoroughness that still registers as shocking across the distance of 16 centuries. When Theodosius died in 395, he divided the empire between his 2 sons, Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west, in a way that proved permanent. The western half stumbled on for another 80 years under a succession of increasingly powerless emperors before the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last of them in 476 and sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople. The message required no translation. There was one Roman emperor now. He lived on the Bosphorus. He had, in the eyes of the Eastern court, always been the senior figure anyway. The West had not fallen so much as it had finally acknowledged what had been true for a generation, that the centre of the Roman world was no longer on the Tiber. There is a particular kind of engineering that transcends its function and becomes something closer to a philosophical statement, a physical argument, made in stone and mortar, about the relationship between human ambition and human vulnerability. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople are that kind of engineering. Built in the early 5th century under the Emperor Theodosius II and his regent Anthemius, they ran across the landward side of the peninsula for nearly 4 miles, from the Golden Horn in the north to the Sea of Marmara in the south. And they were not simply walls in the ordinary sense of the word. They were a system, 3 separate defensive lines of escalating formidability, designed not merely to stop an attacking army, but to exhaust it psychologically before it ever reached the city proper. The outermost line was a relatively modest wall fronted by a deep moat, the kind of obstacle that a determined force might breach with sufficient effort. Behind it stood a wider terrace, open ground that offered no cover to attackers who had somehow managed to cross the moat. Then came the second wall, taller and thicker than the first, with towers rising at regular intervals to give defenders the elevated angles they needed to punish anyone attempting to cross the terrace below. And behind that, rising above everything, stood the great inner wall, massive, patient, ancient in its confidence, studded with 96 towers spaced precisely enough that no section of the wall between them fell outside the range of defensive fire. An attacking army did not face a wall. It faced a succession of increasingly terrible problems, each one more expensive in lives and time than the last. The construction of these walls was itself a response to a specific and urgent reality. Constantine's original fortifications had enclosed a substantial area, but within a single generation, the city's population had exploded beyond them. Constantinople grew with a speed that astonished even its own administrators. People poured in from across the empire, drawn by the commercial opportunities of the new capital, by the imperial court and all the economic activity it generated, by the churches and the theological schools and the simple fact of being at the centre of the world. By the early 5th century, the population had pushed so far beyond the original walls that a new defensive perimeter was not merely desirable but militarily essential. Theodosius II was a child when the decision was made. It was the regent Anthemius who organised and executed the project, and the speed with which the walls were completed suggests an organisational capacity that the western half of the empire had long since lost. The Theodosian walls were finished in 413, and they defined the silhouette of Constantinople for the next 1,000 years. No significant modification to their basic structure was ever necessary. They were simply good enough, better than good enough. From the moment the last stone was set in place, what made the walls extraordinary was not merely their physical construction but the strategic doctrine they embodied. The Byzantine approach to defence was never simply passive, never simply a matter of hiding behind stone and hoping the enemy went away. The towers gave defenders the ability to concentrate fire at any breach or point of pressure. The terraces between the wall lines gave counter-attacking parties space to manoeuvre, and the moat beyond the outer wall slowed the approach of siege equipment long enough to allow defenders to respond and reinforce. The system was designed by people who had thought carefully about how sieges actually worked, about the psychology of attacking armies as much as their logistics, about the relationship between time and morale, about the way that an obstacle that simply cannot be overcome quickly becomes an obstacle that cannot be overcome at all. Constantinople's walls did not need to defeat every army that approached them. They needed only to hold long enough for the attacking force to exhaust its supplies, fracture its coalition, or encounter a threat at home that demanded its attention elsewhere. Over 11 centuries, that is exactly what they did, with a consistency that borders on the miraculous. Arab armies broke against them in the 7th and 8th centuries. Bulgarian forces found them impenetrable. Viking raiders who could terrorize every coastline in Europe stood before the Theodosian walls and understood immediately that this was a different order of problem entirely. The city those walls protected in the late 4th and early 5th centuries was already remarkable by any standard available to the medieval world. Its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Contemporary estimates vary, but by the 5th century, Constantinople was almost certainly the largest city in the Christian world, and possibly the largest city west of China. Its harbour handled traffic from Egypt and Syria and the Black Sea ports simultaneously, the goods of 3 continents passing through markets that operated in a dozen languages. The great covered colonnades of the Mise, the main street that ran through the city's centre, Sheltered shops organised by trade in a system of guilds so precisely regulated that the city prefect's office maintained a detailed manual, later compiled as the Book of the Eparch, specifying exactly where each type of merchant could operate, what prices were acceptable, and what quality standards applied. This was not the improvised commercial chaos of a frontier settlement. It was the organised, self-conscious economy of a civilization that had been thinking about how cities should work for 5 centuries and had developed answers of considerable sophistication. The walls held the city safe. The harbour filled the city with wealth. The administrative tradition kept that wealth organised and productive. These 3 elements together, geography, fortification, and institutional competence, formed the foundation on which 11 centuries of Byzantine survival would rest. Everything else that comes later, every recovery from every catastrophe, every improbable resurrection after what should have been a final defeat, traces back in some essential way to these foundations laid in the city's first century of existence. The walls would eventually fall, but not before they had done their work across a span of time that makes every other medieval fortification look like a temporary arrangement. There are rulers whose ambitions fit comfortably within the boundaries of what their age can actually sustain. And there are rulers whose ambitions exceed those boundaries so dramatically that the attempt to realize them reshapes the world even when it fails. Justinian belongs unmistakably to the second category. He came to the throne in 527 as a man already in his mid-40s, having spent the previous decade effectively running the government, while his uncle Justin occupied the title of emperor, and he arrived at formal power with the clarity of purpose that comes from years of watching someone else hold authority you believe should be yours. His origins were humble in a way that Byzantine court culture found simultaneously impressive and faintly scandalous. Born in a village in what is now Macedonia, or perhaps Serbia, the son of a peasant family, elevated entirely by his uncle's unlikely rise through the military ranks to the imperial throne, he had no ancient bloodline to invoke, no aristocratic network of family obligations to navigate. What he had instead was an intelligence of ferocious organizational precision, a capacity for sustained work that reportedly kept him awake through nights that lesser men spent sleeping, and an ambition so large and so specifically defined that it functioned less like personal vanity and more like a governing philosophy. Justinian wanted to reunite the Roman Empire, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The western provinces that had fallen to Germanic kingdoms over the previous century were, in his view, not lost but temporarily occupied. He was the Roman emperor. Those were Roman lands. The situation was an affront to the natural order of things, and he intended to correct it. The instrument of that correction was Belisarius, one of the most gifted military commanders the ancient or medieval world produced. A general whose campaigns read less like military history and more like the kind of narrative that ancient epic poets constructed around heroes of implausible capability. Belisarius began the reconquest in 533 with a campaign against the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, a state that had controlled the region for a century and had sacked Rome itself in 455, carrying away treasures that had stood in the imperial city since the time of the Republic. The campaign succeeded with a speed that astonished everyone, including Belisarius himself. The Vandal kingdom collapsed in 2 pitched battles over a matter of months. Belisarius entered Carthage without a siege, walking into a city that had not expected to fall and had not prepared to do so. He found the Vandal king's wine still cooling in the cellar, still awaiting a dinner that was never going to happen. It was the kind of detail that ancient and medieval historians loved to record, precisely because it captured something true about how completely the resistance had been overwhelmed. A civilization interrupted mid-gesture, caught in the ordinary moment before the extraordinary one arrived. The treasure of the Vandals, including the sacred objects that Titus had taken from Jerusalem in 70 CE, and that the Vandals had in turn taken from Rome, was loaded onto ships and sent to Constantinople. Justinian received it in triumph. The first piece of the reconquest was complete, and it had taken less than a year. Italy followed, beginning in 535, and it did not go nearly as cleanly. The Gothic War, as historians call it, lasted 20 years and consumed resources, lives, and organisational energy on a scale that North Africa had not begun to suggest. The Ostrogoths proved far more resilient opponents than the Vandals, a people who had ruled Italy for half a century, who knew its terrain intimately, and who produced in their king Totila a commander of genuine strategic ability, who understood that the war could not be won in pitched battle against Belisarius, and so chose instead a grinding attritional campaign that turned Italy itself into the primary casualty. The war swept back and forth across the peninsula with a destructiveness that reduced cities which had survived the chaos of the 5th century to rubble and depopulated agricultural regions that had fed large populations for generations. Rome changed hands multiple times, its population contracting with each passage of armies through its streets, until the city that had once held 1 million inhabitants was reduced to something closer to a large town sheltering within the vast ruins of its former self. The countryside was stripped by competing forces until the landscape of Italy bore wounds that would not fully heal for centuries. Justinian's generals eventually prevailed. The Gothic kingdom was destroyed by 554, but the Italy they reconquered was a devastated shell of what the campaign had been launched to recover. The province of Spain was partially reclaimed in the 550s, when a Visigothic civil war created an opening for Byzantine forces to establish a foothold in the southeast. But the full restoration of the Western Empire, even had Justinian lived another century and possessed unlimited resources, was almost certainly beyond what his military and economic situation could have sustained. The cost of the reconquest was not simply counted in soldiers and gold, though both were consumed in quantities that strained the imperial system severely. It was counted in the structural overextension that the campaigns produced, the commitment of forces and resources to western frontiers that simultaneously required maintenance of the eastern frontier against Persia, management of the Balkan approaches against various peoples pressing southward, and the suppression of internal disruptions that a state under permanent military stress inevitably generates. Justinian governed with the confidence of a man who believed that sufficient will could overcome insufficient resources, and for long stretches of his reign that belief was not entirely wrong. But belief in will is a tool that works until it does not, and the empire that Justinian left in 565 was geographically larger than the one he had inherited, but financially and demographically weaker. Its reconquered western territories, shallow acquisitions, expensive to defend, and incompletely integrated into the imperial system. Italy began slipping away almost immediately as the Lombards invaded in 568. The ambition had been genuine. The achievement was real. And the price was an overextension that would define the crisis waiting in the following century. On a January morning in 532, Constantinople burned. The fire was not accidental and it was not small. It was the physical expression of a political crisis so severe that it nearly ended Justinian's reign before it had properly begun. The Nika riots, as history remembers them, began as a dispute between the chariot racing factions that dominated the hippodrome's culture and that served as the primary vehicle for public political expression in a city where organised opposition to the emperor was otherwise structurally impossible. The Blues and the Greens, whose rivalry normally expressed itself in the relatively contained violence of racing partisanship, found in January of 532 a common cause in their shared fury at unpopular imperial officials. The factions demanded dismissals. The emperor hesitated. The crowd, electrified by its own unexpected unity, escalated from demands to destruction, from destruction to open insurrection, burning large sections of the city and proclaiming a rival emperor from the senatorial class. For several days, Justinian's government lost control of its own capital, an extraordinary humiliation for a ruler who prided himself on administrative mastery. Contemporary accounts describe the emperor preparing to flee by ship, his nerve broken by the scale of the violence surrounding the palace walls. What stopped him was his wife, Theodora, a former actress from the Constantinople circus whose origins the aristocracy found permanently scandalous, stood before the assembled court and delivered the words that Procopius, the historian who recorded them, placed among the most remarkable ever spoken in that throne room. She did not wish to live stripped of imperial purple. She said, the old saying was compelling to her, that the purple was a noble burial shroud. Those who had lived as monarchs could not endure to live as exiles. She was not making an abstract philosophical point. She was telling her husband and his generals, with complete clarity, to stop running. Justinian stayed. The generals Belisarius and Mundus moved against the rioters in the Hippodrome. Estimates of the dead run to 30,000. The uprising ended in an afternoon of controlled slaughter, and from its ashes, Justinian built something that has outlasted everything else he ever made. The Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, was constructed between 532 and 537, a period of 5 years that still produces genuine astonishment among structural engineers who study it. The architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus designed a building that had no real precedent in the history of human construction. Its central dome, roughly 30 meters in diameter, appears to float above the nave, supported not by the walls beneath it, but by a series of half-domes and arches that distribute the dome's weight outward and downward in ways that the builders themselves did not fully understand through mathematical calculation, but arrived at through an intuitive structural genius that modern engineering can describe, but still struggles entirely to explain. Around the base of the dome, 40 windows admit light in a continuous band that makes the dome appear detached from its supports, resting on air and illumination rather than on stone, hovering in a space that seems to belong simultaneously to the physical world and to something beyond it. When Justinian entered the completed building for the first time, he is reported to have said simply, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." Whether he actually spoke those words cannot be verified across 15 centuries. What is certain is that the Hagia Sophia transformed the human experience of interior architectural space in ways that had never been achieved before, and that it has never been entirely surpassed since. The second achievement of Justinian's reign that outlasted his military campaigns by centuries was legal rather than architectural, but its global consequences were arguably even larger. Roman law had accumulated across 1,000 years into a body of texts so voluminous, so internally contradictory, and so difficult to navigate that practicing lawyers and imperial administrators found it nearly impossible to use with confidence. Justinian commissioned a small group of legal scholars under the direction of the jurist Tribonian to compile, organize, and rationalize the entire tradition. The result, completed between 529 and 534, was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It consisted of 4 elements: the Codex, an organized collection of imperial legislation; the Digest, a compilation of writings from the great classical jurists with contradictions resolved and redundancies eliminated; the Institutes, an introductory textbook for legal students; and the Novels, a collection of Justinian's own new legislation. The Corpus Juris Civilis became the foundation of legal education and practice throughout the Byzantine world. When it was rediscovered in Western Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries, it became the basis for the legal systems of most of continental Europe, and through those systems shaped virtually every legal tradition in the modern world outside the Anglo-American common law: French courts, German courts, Italian courts, Spanish courts, and their countless derivatives across South America, East Asia, and Africa all carry the intellectual DNA of decisions made by Tribonian and his colleagues in Justinian's Constantinople. That is not poetic exaggeration. It is the documented history of how legal traditions actually travel through time. The Justinianic plague arrived in 541, riding grain ships from Egypt into a city that had no framework for understanding what was about to happen to it. The disease, bubonic plague, almost certainly, carried by fleas on rats moving through the empire's grain supply, spread through Constantinople with a speed and lethality that collapsed the ordinary structures of civic life within weeks. Bodies accumulated faster than the living could bury them. Mass graves were opened outside the walls. Commerce stopped. Courts ceased functioning. The emperor himself contracted the disease, came to the edge of death, and recovered, returning to governance in a city that had lost a terrifying fraction of its population in a matter of months. Modern estimates suggest the plague killed between 25 and 50 million people across the Mediterranean world in its initial outbreak, and returned repeatedly across the following 2 centuries. Each return depleting the demographic and economic base that Justinian's military ambitions depended upon. The reconquest had been expensive enough when the empire was at full strength, conducted against the background of a pandemic that killed soldiers, farmers, and tax-paying citizens with democratic indifference. It became something close to an act of civilizational overreach, magnificent, consequential, and ultimately unsustainable at the scale its architect had imagined. If you were to choose a single century in Byzantine history and ask which one came closest to ending the story entirely, the answer would not require much deliberation. The 7th century was a sequence of catastrophes so severe, arriving so rapidly and from so many directions simultaneously, that the empire's continued existence seemed genuinely doubtful at multiple points within a single human lifetime. It was not a century of gradual decline, the slow erosion of capacity that most empires experience as they age. It was something more violent and more compressed than that, a series of hammer blows falling on a structure that had not fully recovered from the previous impact before the next one arrived. That Byzantium survived it at all is one of the most remarkable facts in the political history of the medieval world. And understanding how it survived requires sitting with the full weight of what it endured. The century opened with Persia, the Sassanid Persian Empire, which had been the Byzantine world's great eastern rival for 3 centuries, a civilization of comparable sophistication and military organization that had always pressed against the eastern frontier with the patient intensity of a force that believed, not without justification, that history was eventually going to go its way. Under its king Khosrow II, the Persians launched between 603 and 628 an offensive of extraordinary ambition, sweeping through Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, the wealthiest provinces of the Byzantine world, with a speed and completeness that the defenders had no adequate answer for. Jerusalem fell in 614, and the Persians carried away the true cross, the relic believed to be the actual wood of Christ's crucifixion. That act struck the Christian world with the force of a theological catastrophe as much as a military one. Egypt, the granary of the empire, fell in 619. Constantinople itself was besieged in 626 by a combined Persian and Avar force pressing simultaneously from both sides of the Bosphorus, the most dangerous moment the city had faced since its founding nearly 3 centuries earlier. The emperor who navigated this opening phase of catastrophe was Heraclius, and his story reads less like Byzantine administrative history and more like the kind of narrative that ancient epic poets constructed around figures of impossible endurance. He had come to power in 610 by sailing from North Africa to Constantinople with a fleet of loyal troops and removing the genuinely terrible Emperor Phocas, a man whose reign had combined military incompetence with domestic brutality in proportions that made his overthrow a relief to virtually everyone who witnessed it. Heraclius inherited an empire in crisis so acute that he reportedly considered moving the capital to Carthage, abandoning Constantinople entirely and governing the reduced empire from the western Mediterranean. He stayed instead, a decision whose consequences rippled across the following centuries in ways that could not have been visible to him at the moment he made it. He reorganized what remained of the military and the financial system with considerable ingenuity. stripping church treasuries of their gold with the reluctant blessing of the patriarch to fund campaigns that the depleted imperial treasury could not otherwise have supported. Then, between 622 and 628, he launched a series of campaigns against Persia that rank among the most remarkable military performances of the medieval world. He drove deep into Persian territory, through what is now Armenia, into Iraq, into Iran itself, striking at the symbolic and economic heart of the Persian state with the same speed and focus that Persian armies had applied to Byzantine, Syria and Egypt a decade earlier. The Persians, destabilized by his campaigns and fracturing under internal political crisis, sued for peace. The true cross was returned. The lost provinces came back. Heraclius returned to Constantinople in triumph, and the celebrations that greeted him were those of a people who had genuinely believed, not unreasonably, that their civilization was finished. He had perhaps 4 years to enjoy the recovery before everything changed again, and changed in a direction that no strategic calculation available to any Byzantine emperor in 628 could have anticipated with any precision. In 632, the Prophet Muhammad died in Medina. The Arab armies that had been gathering under the banner of Islam in the years since Muhammad's first revelations began moving outward from the Arabian Peninsula with a speed and intensity that neither Byzantium nor the exhausted Persian state had any adequate framework for understanding. These were not raiders in the traditional sense, not the Arab auxiliaries and border skirmishers that both empires had managed for generations through a combination of subsidy and military pressure. They were armies shaped by a new faith, motivated by a conviction that combined religious certainty with a warrior culture of considerable military effectiveness, and they moved with the momentum of people who believed that history itself was on their side. The Persian Empire, bled white by decades of warfare with Byzantium, collapsed before them with a finality that still surprises. As a political entity, Sassanid Persia ceased to exist within 20 years of Muhammad's death. Then the Arabs turned toward Byzantine Syria and Palestine. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Yarmouk in August of 636. In a river valley in what is today southern Syria, a Byzantine army, probably substantially larger than the Arab force. He was destroyed over several days of fighting in circumstances that the sources describe, but that historians continue to debate in their precise tactical details. The result, however, was beyond debate. Syria fell, Palestine followed. Egypt, which Heraclius had so recently and painfully reclaimed from Persia, fell to Arab armies in 641, the same year Heraclius died. Alone and broken, on the shores of the Bosphorus, he had spent his reign defending. The loss of Egypt was arguably the single most consequential territorial change in Byzantine history, more damaging in its long-term structural effects than any military defeat before or after. Egypt's grain had fed Constantinople and the armies that defended it. Egypt's tax revenue had underwritten the military budget that kept the frontiers functional. Egypt's papyrus had supplied the bureaucratic apparatus with the material it needed to maintain the administrative records on which imperial governance depended. Losing Egypt meant losing the economic foundation of the empire as it had existed for centuries. Not merely a province, but the metabolic core of the entire system. The Byzantine Empire that emerged from the Arab conquests was not simply smaller. It was a fundamentally different kind of state, operating on a reduced resource base that demanded new answers to every question about how an empire survives in a world that has decided it should not. Necessity is the oldest teacher in the history of statecraft, and the lesson it delivered to Byzantium in the aftermath of the Arab conquests was unambiguous. The empire could no longer afford to fight the way it had always fought. The vast professional armies that Justinian had deployed across 3 continents, the centralized logistical apparatus that had supplied campaigns from Britain to Mesopotamia, the tax base drawn from the wealthy provinces of Syria and Egypt that had underwritten it all, these were gone, and they were not coming back. What remained was a reduced empire, a depleted treasury, a traumatized population, and a set of frontiers that were, by any honest military assessment, very nearly indefensible with the resources available to defend them. A lesser civilization would have accepted that assessment as a verdict and made whatever arrangements could be made for an orderly dissolution. Byzantium instead did something more interesting. It invented a new way of being an empire, one that matched its reduced means to its unchanged ambitions with a pragmatic creativity that deserves considerably more admiration than it typically receives. The response to this crisis produced what historians call the theme system, one of the most significant administrative reorganizations in Byzantine history. Faced with the impossible problem of defending a much reduced territory with depleted resources, the Byzantine government began assigning large military districts, called themes, from the Greek word for a regiment, to military governors called strategoi, who combined both military and civilian authority within their regions. Soldiers settled in the themes were granted parcels of land in exchange for military service, creating a system in which the army partially sustained itself from the agricultural production of the territory it was defending, rather than drawing entirely on centralized tax revenue. The elegance of the arrangement was that it aligned the interests of the soldiers with the survival of the specific territory they occupied. A farmer soldier defending his own land fights with a different motivation than a professional mercenary defending someone else's province. The theme system was not invented all at once in a single administrative decree. It evolved across the course of the 7th century as necessity pushed improvisation towards something approaching coherent policy, each regional adaptation informing the next, until the pattern became recognizable as a system. But the result was an empire that had genuinely learned to fight differently, to defend in depth rather than at the frontier line, to absorb raids and punish them rather than trying to prevent every incursion, to preserve its core territories by accepting the loss of the indefensible periphery with a strategic patience that earlier emperors would have found psychologically impossible. The Byzantine Empire that emerged from this reorganization was smaller and poorer than the one Justinian had ruled, but it was also more resilient in a specific and important sense. Its military capacity was no longer entirely dependent on the health of a centralized treasury that a single catastrophic defeat could empty. The land-holding soldiers of the themes were a distributed resource, harder to destroy in one blow, harder to exhaust through the kind of sustained attritional campaign that had bled earlier Byzantine armies white. The system had real weaknesses that would manifest dramatically in later centuries, but in the 7th and 8th centuries it gave the empire exactly what it needed. A way to keep fighting when the conventional means of fighting were no longer available. The Constantinople that Arab armies failed to capture in 2 major sieges, the first running from 674 to 678, the second and more dangerous, from 717 to 718, was defended partly by its walls, partly by its geographic position, and partly by a weapon that had no precedent in the ancient world and would not be fully understood by modern chemistry for 13 more centuries. Greek fire, as it came to be called, was a substance that burned on water, could not be extinguished by water, and could be projected from bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine warships with sufficient range and force to set enemy vessels ablaze at distances that violated everything opposing sailors understood about the behavior of flame. The Arab naval forces that attempted to blockade Constantinople found their wooden ships catching fire in ways that seemed to defy natural law. The fleet broke, the siege lifted. Greek fire saved the city again in 718. And its formula, jealously guarded as the most sensitive state secret in the imperial arsenal, remained one of Byzantium's most decisive military advantages for centuries. The exact composition of Greek fire remains unknown to this day. Modern historians and chemists have proposed various combinations involving petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and other compounds, but no modern researcher has been able to reproduce its behavior precisely. The Byzantines apparently lost the formula themselves at some point in the 11th or 12th century, a fact that tells you something either about the fragility of institutional knowledge or about the quality of Byzantine record-keeping in that period, and perhaps something about both simultaneously. The 8th century brought a crisis of an entirely different character. one that came not from outside the walls, but from within the theology that gave the empire its identity and its legitimacy, the iconoclast controversy, which dominated Byzantine politics and religious life for most of the century, and returned for a second, equally bitter round in the 9th. Began in 726 when the Emperor Leo III ordered the removal and destruction of religious images throughout the empire, starting with a famous image of Christ above the main entrance to the imperial palace complex. His theological reasoning drew on a genuine and long-standing tradition of Christian anxiety about the veneration of images, the concern that kissing a painted portrait of the Virgin Mary crossed a line that the commandment against idolatry had drawn clearly. His practical reasoning was almost certainly also shaped by the remarkable military successes of Islamic forces, whose theology explicitly rejected images, and whose victories some Byzantine thinkers interpreted as evidence of divine favour, granted to the iconoclasts and divine displeasure directed at an empire that had surrounded itself with holy pictures. The response from the church hierarchy, from the monasteries, and from a significant portion of the population was fierce and sustained. Pope Gregory III condemned iconoclasm in Rome. Monks who refused to destroy images were persecuted with a thoroughness that produced martyrs and deepened the controversy rather than resolving it. The Empress Irene finally restored the veneration of images at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. The controversy mattered far beyond the theological question it raised. It drove a permanent wedge between Constantinople and Rome, deepening the ecclesiastical division that would eventually become the Great Schism. And it raised in sharp and uncomfortable form a question that Byzantine political culture was always reluctant to address directly: whether the emperor had the right to dictate theological truth, and what recourse the church possessed when it disagreed. There is a particular satisfaction in watching a civilization that has spent generations absorbing punishment finally begin to strike back, and the 9th and 10th centuries offered Byzantium exactly that experience. After 200 years of defensive improvisation, of contracting frontiers and depleted treasuries and theological controversies that consumed energy the empire could barely afford to spend, the arrival of the Macedonian dynasty in 867 inaugurated a period of recovery, so thorough and so confident that historians have given it its own name, the Macedonian Renaissance. The dynasty itself began in blood, as Byzantine dynasties so often did. Quote, Basil, the man who gave it his name, was a peasant from Macedonia who had risen through the imperial court by a combination of physical impressiveness, political shrewdness, and a willingness to commit acts of violence at moments when violence was what the situation rewarded. He had murdered his way to the throne, first eliminating a court favourite who had sponsored his rise, then disposing of the Emperor Michael III himself, whose drinking and erratic governance had made him simultaneously dangerous to be near and politically vulnerable. Byzantine historians who wrote under Basil's successors naturally found ways to frame these events in the most flattering possible light. But the bones of the story are clear enough. The Macedonian dynasty began with a killing, and it would rule Constantinople for nearly 2 centuries, producing some of the most capable administrators, military commanders, and cultural patrons in Byzantine history. That combination of violent origins and genuine achievement is itself characteristically Byzantine, a civilization that never quite managed to separate the quality of its rulers from the ruthlessness required to become one. The recovery of Byzantine power across the 9th and 10th centuries rested on several mutually reinforcing foundations. The theme system had stabilized the frontiers sufficiently that the constant crisis mode of the 7th century gave way to something approaching strategic predictability. The empire knew where its enemies were, knew roughly what they were capable of, and had developed responses sophisticated enough to manage most threats without catastrophic loss. The Arab Caliphate was beginning its own long fragmentation. The political unity that had made the early Islamic conquests so overwhelming, dissolving into competing dynasties and regional powers that pressed against the Byzantine frontier with less coordination and less irresistible momentum than their predecessors had generated. The Bulgarian conversion to Orthodox Christianity in 864 removed one persistent source of pressure from the Balkans, not immediately and not completely, since Bulgarian ambitions remained a serious Byzantine concern for another century, but meaningfully, because a Christian Bulgaria entered a different kind of relationship with Constantinople than a pagan one mediated by shared religious culture and ecclesiastical hierarchy in ways that pure military rivalry was not. Meanwhile, the empire had gradually rebuilt its tax base and its administrative competence as the disruptions of the 7th century receded into institutional memory, and the theme system generated the agricultural stability that sustained both the military and the treasury. The cultural achievements of the Macedonian period were genuine and significant in ways that the empire's later reputation in Western historiography has consistently undervalued. Constantinople in the 9th and 10th centuries was the intellectual capital of the Christian world by a margin so large that comparison is almost unfair. The city housed perhaps 500,000 people, vastly larger than anything in contemporary Western Europe, where Charlemagne's greatest city of Aachen held perhaps 20,000 inhabitants, and Rome itself was a diminished town, sheltering in the vast ruins of its ancient self. The imperial library preserved texts that would otherwise have been lost entirely. Manuscripts of ancient Greek literature, philosophy, mathematics, and medicine that Byzantine scholars copied and annotated and argued about in the monasteries and schools that dotted the city and the provincial centres. The missionary activity of Saints Cyril and Methodius, supported directly by Constantinople and driven by a sophisticated understanding of how religious conversion creates lasting cultural and political dependencies, carried Orthodox Christianity and the Cyrillic alphabet into the Slavic world in ways whose consequences are still entirely visible today. The religious and cultural identity of Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and most of Slavic Eastern Europe was shaped in this period by decisions made in Constantinople about how to extend the empire's spiritual influence beyond the reach of its armies. That was soft power, exercised with a strategic intelligence that the empire's military achievements in the same period have tended to overshadow in popular historical memory. The warrior emperors of the Macedonian dynasty's later generations captured the imagination most vividly because they did something that had seemed barely conceivable a century earlier. They expanded. Nicephorus Phorgas, who seized the throne in 963 after a career spent on the eastern frontier fighting Arab raiders in Anatolia, brought to the imperial office the organizational habits and tactical thinking of someone who had never encountered a military problem that better cavalry and more disciplined logistics could not improve. He recaptured Cilicia and significant portions of Syria from Arab control. He reconquered Crete, which had been a base for Muslim pirates raiding the Aegean for over a century, in a campaign of 961 that eliminated the threat those raiders posed to Byzantine maritime commerce and demonstrated that the empire could project offensive naval power at a distance when its commanders organized the logistics with sufficient care. His campaigns into Syria reached Antioch, which was retaken for the empire in 969, a city that had been outside Byzantine control for 300 years. Since the Arab conquests of Heraclius's final years, John Tzimiskes, who murdered Nicephorus and claimed the throne, pushed further still, conducting campaigns that brought Byzantine armies to the outskirts of Jerusalem itself, within sight of the city that the entire Christian world regarded as the center of sacred geography. The empire did not take Jerusalem. The strategic wisdom to avoid overextension held. Barely, but the fact that Byzantine armies stood within reach of it in the late 10th century, after the catastrophes of the 7th, was evidence of a recovery so complete that it bordered on the improbable. The patient work of 2 centuries of defensive resilience had produced an empire capable of doing what empires are supposed to do, moving forward rather than simply holding on. There are emperors whose reigns produce impressive results, and emperors whose reigns reshape the fundamental conditions of the civilization they govern. And then there is Basil II, a figure who belongs in a category that Byzantine history offers only once. The emperor against whom all subsequent emperors were measured and almost invariably found wanting. He ruled from 976 to 1025. Nearly half a century, on the throne of a state that had been consuming its rulers with violent regularity for generations. And he used that time with a focused, unsentimental effectiveness that transformed the empire's strategic position in the Balkans and its internal political balance simultaneously. He was not an easy man to admire in the way that charismatic rulers invite admiration. He was ascetic to the point of severity, reportedly sleeping on a simple pallet and eating plain food, while the court around him maintained its elaborate ceremonial splendor. He was suspicious of flattery in a court culture that had elevated flattery to an art form. He was patient in a way that his enemies consistently mistook for passivity, right up until the moment when his patience expired and the consequences arrived with a completeness that left no room for recovery. His biographers, working under his successors, struggled to make him conventionally heroic and largely gave up, settling instead for accurate, which in Basil's case was more than sufficient. He came to the throne as a teenager, and the first decade of his reign was consumed not by the external campaigns that would define his historical reputation, but by two major aristocratic revolts that came close to removing him before he had properly begun. The revolts were led by powerful military families from Anatolia, the Phocas and Skleros clans, great landowners whose private armies and provincial influence gave them the resources to challenge imperial authority directly. Basil survived both revolts through a combination of military assistance from Vladimir of Kiev, whose 6,000 Norse warriors arrived as part of the arrangement that led to Russia's conversion to Orthodox Christianity, and the kind of tactical flexibility that distinguished genuine political intelligence from mere stubbornness. What he learned from those early years of fighting for his own throne never left him. He emerged from the experience with a profound and permanent suspicion of the great Anatolian military families whose estates and private armies made revolts structurally possible. And he spent significant portions of his long reign systematically reducing their capacity to threaten imperial authority. Legislation limiting the ability of large landowners to absorb the small holdings of military farmers, the peasant soldiers whose economic independence sustained the theme armies, was enforced with a rigour that his predecessors had proclaimed but rarely maintained. The great aristocrats found this infuriating. Basil found their fury irrelevant. The peasant soldiers of the theme system were the backbone of his army, and protecting their economic position was not a matter of sentiment, but of strategic necessity. The campaign against Bulgaria was the defining military achievement of his reign and the source of the epithet by which history has remembered him across 1,000 years. The Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Samuel had been the dominant power in the Balkans for decades, a state that had inflicted crushing defeats on Byzantine armies and expanded its territory at Byzantine expense with the confidence of a power that had decided the regional balance had permanently shifted in its favour. Samuel was a genuine military talent, a commander who understood strategic initiative and who had used it effectively to build a Bulgarian state that stretched across most of the Balkan peninsula. Basil spent nearly 20 years dismantling it. The campaign was not a series of dramatic pitched battles producing decisive results in a single season. It was something slower and more relentless, a grinding attritional war of annual campaigns, systematic devastation of agricultural regions that supplied Bulgarian armies, patient reduction of fortified positions, and the strategic patience of a commander who had decided that time was his weapon and intended to use it without hurry. The Bulgarians won battles. They could not win the war, because Basil never allowed a single defeat to alter the fundamental trajectory of his campaign. And Samuel did not possess the resources to sustain a prolonged attritional contest against an empire whose fiscal and demographic base, though reduced from its peak, still dwarfed his own. The moment that history fixed upon came in 1014, at a mountain pass called Kleidion in what is now Bulgaria. Basil's army caught a large Bulgarian force in a position it could not escape and destroyed it comprehensively. Approximately 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers were taken prisoner. What Basil did next has been recorded, debated, and morally assessed by every historian who has written about him since. And it resists comfortable resolution. He blinded 99 of every 100 prisoners, leaving one eye to every 100th man, so that the sighted men could lead the blinded ones home to their king. The columns of mutilated soldiers making their way back through the Bulgarian countryside were a message written in human suffering, and delivered with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that psychological impact and military victory were not the same thing, and that he needed both. When Samuel saw the army of blind men returning to him, he suffered what the chronicles describe as a stroke, collapsing at the sight of what had been done to his soldiers, and died 2 days later. Whether the stroke was medically real, or whether Samuel simply could not survive the knowledge of what his kingdom had become in that moment, the chronicles do not say. Within 4 years, Bulgaria had been absorbed into the empire. The Balkans were Byzantine for the first time since the 7th century, and Basil the Bulgar Slayer had secured a strategic position in southeastern Europe that his successors would spend the following century failing to maintain, when he died in 1025 without an heir, leaving the throne to relatives who possessed none of his combination of military ability and administrative ruthlessness. The machinery he had built began almost immediately to slow. The peasant land protections relaxed. The great aristocratic families recovered their influence. The army that Basil had maintained through 50 years of disciplined attention began the slow deterioration that would make the crisis of 1071 not merely possible but inevitable. There are years in history that function less like points on a timeline and more like hinges. Moments where the weight of everything that comes after swings visibly on what happens in a single compressed period of time. For the Byzantine Empire, that year was 1071, not because everything was fine before it and everything was ruined after it. The deterioration had been building for decades, visible to anyone paying careful attention, but because 1071 was the year when the consequences of that deterioration arrived simultaneously from 2 different directions, with a completeness that removed any remaining ambiguity about the nature of the situation. The empire that entered 1071 still possessed the psychological inheritance of Basil's conquests. The memory of Byzantine armies standing outside Jerusalem, the institutional confidence of a state that had survived everything the medieval world had thrown at it. The empire that emerged from 1071 possessed something considerably more valuable and considerably more painful, an accurate understanding of what it had actually become. The central military problem that produced this crisis traced directly to the decades following Basil's death. The tension between the needs of the professional army that the campaigns of reconquest had required and the economic interests of the great Anatolian landowners whom Basil had constrained was not a tension that resolved itself naturally, in the direction of military effectiveness. Without a ruler of Basil's specific combination of legislative will and military authority enforcing the peasant land protections, the protections eroded. Weak emperors, and the decades after 1025 produced a remarkable succession of them, found the great aristocratic families useful allies whose support was worth purchasing with the relaxation of inconvenient restrictions. The small-holding military farmers who had provided the theme armies with their most reliable infantry began losing their land to the expanding estates of the powerful, becoming tenant farmers or drifting to the cities, their military obligations dissolving, along with their economic independence. The army that faced the crisis of 1071 was measurably not the army that Basil II had commanded. And the difference was not primarily a matter of numbers or equipment, but of the structural foundation that sustained military capacity across generations. In April of 1071, the Normans, those extraordinary descendants of Norse settlers who had established themselves in northern France 2 centuries earlier, and who had been expanding aggressively around the Mediterranean with a military energy that combined Viking ruthlessness with feudal organization, captured the city of Bari in southern Italy. Bari was the last Byzantine foothold on the Italian peninsula, the final remnant of the reconquest that Justinian had purchased at such catastrophic cost in the 6th century. Its fall was not militarily surprising. The Italian position had been eroding for decades under Norman pressure. but it was symbolically devastating. The Italian Reconquest, which had consumed 20 years of warfare and reduced the peninsula to ruin before it was achieved, which had been defended and maintained for 5 centuries against Lombards and Franks and various other claimants, was definitively and permanently over. Everything Justinian's generals had bled for in the Gothic War had now slipped away entirely, and no Byzantine army was ever going to march back into Italy to reclaim it. That was April. Then came August. And August was worse. The Battle of Manzikert on the 26th of August, 1071, in the highlands of eastern Anatolia near Lake Van, has been described as the most consequential military defeat in Byzantine history. And that description is accurate if properly understood. A Byzantine army commanded by the Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes encountered the Seljuk Turkish forces of Alp Arslan and was destroyed. Not merely defeated in the tactical sense of losing a battle and retreating in good order, but destroyed comprehensively. Its cohesion broken, its supporting units scattered, its emperor captured alive on the field. That last detail, a Byzantine emperor taken prisoner in battle, was without precedent in the entire history of the empire. It had simply never happened before, and its psychological impact on both sides of the conflict was proportionally enormous. The ransom terms Romanos negotiated were reasonable enough that he agreed to them and expected to return to his throne. He never did. His political enemies in Constantinople used his captivity as the occasion for a coup, placing a rival on the throne. And when Romanos returned, he found himself not welcomed, but blinded and exiled and dead within months. The specific combination of fates that Byzantine political culture reserved for rivals it wished to eliminate, without the theological complications of outright execution. What Manzikert actually destroyed was not Byzantine Anatolia in a single afternoon. That is the oversimplification that many accounts perpetuate. What it destroyed was the credibility of the Byzantine field army as a force capable of defeating a major Turkish army in open engagement. And in doing so, it removed the primary deterrent that had kept Turkish warlords from moving freely through the Anatolian interior. In the decade of civil war that followed, as Byzantine factions fought each other for control of the throne with the focused intensity that internal rivals reserve for moments when the external threat should be commanding everyone's attention, Turkish chieftains and their followers poured into Anatolian valleys that had been solidly Byzantine for 4 centuries. They did not conquer in the formal sense of organized military campaigns against defended positions. They settled, moving into agricultural regions and provincial cities that the distracted government in Constantinople had temporarily stopped defending, establishing themselves in the landscape with the quiet permanence of people who had decided they were staying. When Alexios I Komnenos seized the throne in 1081 and began the serious work of stabilizing the situation, much of Anatolia had already changed hands in the way that actually matters, not through formal surrender, but through the movement of populations and the transfer of agricultural production to new masters. Alexios could raid and negotiate and recover individual cities along the western coast. And he did. But the demographic and economic foundation that the Anatolian interior had provided, the peasant soldiers, the agricultural tax revenue, the recruiting ground for Byzantine armies, was gone in ways that no subsequent military campaign would fully restore. Alexios I Komnenos is one of the most interesting figures in Byzantine history and one of the most difficult to evaluate fairly, partly because our most detailed source for his reign is the Alexiad, a biography written by his daughter Anna Komnene, who combined genuine historical talent with an understandable bias toward presenting her father in the most favourable light that careful prose could achieve. He came to the throne at 33, inheriting simultaneously a Norman invasion in the Balkans, Turkish occupation of most of Anatolia, an internal financial crisis caused by decades of fiscal mismanagement under his predecessors, and a military establishment whose capacity had been degraded by precisely the neglect of the peasant-soldier system that Basil II had spent his reign protecting. The situation was not merely difficult, it was the kind of compound crisis that breaks states, multiple simultaneous emergencies, each demanding resources that the others had already consumed, with no obvious sequence in which they could be addressed that did not make at least one of them considerably worse. That Alexios not only survived it but rebuilt something functional from its wreckage says something important about both his personal capabilities and the institutional resilience of the Byzantine state he had inherited. A civilization with less accumulated administrative depth would not have given him the tools to work with. He used those tools with a pragmatic creativity that his daughter's admiring account, even filtered through filial devotion, captures with genuine vividness. His management of the Norman threat illustrates his method with particular clarity. The Normans under Robert Guiscard were pressing into Byzantine territory in the Balkans from their base in southern Italy, with the same aggressive energy they had applied everywhere else around the Mediterranean. In England, in Sicily, in the Holy Land, and the Byzantine military in its current condition was not capable of stopping them through straightforward confrontation. Alexios's solution was diplomatic as much as military. He brought Venice into the conflict on the Byzantine side by granting Venetian merchants trading privileges of extraordinary generosity, a complete exemption from the customs duties that other traders paid throughout the empire, plus their own quarter in Constantinople and their own courts operating outside Byzantine jurisdiction. The Venetians received, in exchange for their naval assistance against the Normans, a commercial position in Constantinople that effectively gave them control of Byzantine foreign trade at the moment of the agreement's signing, and that would compound in its consequences across the following century. It solved Alexios's immediate problem with a speed and efficiency that conventional military means could not have matched. It created a long-term dependency on Venetian naval power and a long-term drain on Byzantine commercial revenue whose full cost would not become apparent until the empire could no longer afford to pay it. That was the characteristic Komnenian trade. Present crisis resolved at the expense of future structural vulnerability. The bill deferred with the confidence of a dynasty that intended to remain in power long enough to manage whatever arrived. It was Alexios who sent the embassy to Pope Urban II in 1095, requesting Western military assistance against the Turks, an embassy that contributed directly to Urban's decision to call the First Crusade at Clermont that same year. Alexios's actual request was probably fairly limited and specific: trained soldiers who could serve in the Byzantine army under Byzantine command, helping recover Anatolian territory that Constantinople could then administer as it had before Manzikert. What arrived instead was something quite different in character, composition, and intention: several large armies of Western knights, motivated by a mixture of genuine religious conviction, land hunger, and ambitions for glory that the Byzantine court found both impressive and deeply inconvenient. Commanded by independent nobles who owed allegiance to their own princes rather than to the Byzantine emperor, and who had their own ideas about what recovering the Holy Land meant and who should control what was recovered. Alexios managed the First Crusade with considerable diplomatic skill, extracting oaths from the crusade leaders that territories reconquered from the Turks would be returned to Byzantine suzerainty, using the crusading army as a tool to recover Western Anatolia while it was still marching toward the Levant. He could not compel the crusaders to honour those oaths once they moved beyond his reach, and they largely did not. The Crusader principalities established in Syria and Palestine operated as independent states, their relationship with Constantinople ranging from uneasy coexistence to active hostility depending on which emperor and which crusader lord were involved at any particular moment. The Komnenian dynasty that Alexios founded ruled Constantinople from 1081 to 1185, and produced a recovery that was real in certain respects while leaving the fundamental structural problem entirely unresolved: John III Komnenos, who ruled from 1118 to 1143, and whom Byzantine historians considered the finest emperor of his dynasty, spent his reign in constant campaigning, recovering coastal Anatolia, reasserting Byzantine authority over the Crusader Principality of Antioch, conducting operations in the Balkans with energy and discipline that recalled the great warrior emperors of the Macedonian period. He died from an accidental arrow wound during a hunting expedition in Cilicia. an ending that combined the particular irony so many warrior rulers throughout history have encountered, surviving a dozen pitched battles only to be killed by a misfire in peacetime. His son, Manuel I, inherited his campaigning instinct but applied it with less strategic discipline, conducting expensive operations in Italy, Hungary, and the Levant that extended Byzantine military reach beyond the empire's actual capacity to sustain territorial gains. Manuel's defeat at Myriokephalon in 1176, at the hands of the Seljuk Turks in the mountains of central Anatolia, ended definitively the possibility of Byzantine recovery of the Anatolian plateau. The empire had spent a century hoping that Manzikert could be undone through sufficiently determined military effort. Myriokephalon delivered the final answer. It could not. What the Komnenian period had actually accomplished was the creation of an empire that looked powerful, maintained the ceremonial and institutional forms of power with considerable sophistication, and rested on foundations: mercenary armies, Italian commercial networks, aristocratic military service purchased with ever-expanding privileges that were borrowed rather than owned, functional until the moment they were tested by something larger than the Komnenian system could absorb. There is a particular kind of catastrophe that history produces occasionally, one that emerges not from malice or stupidity, but from a chain of individually reasonable decisions, each made by people who could see clearly enough in the immediate term, but could not quite perceive where the accumulating logic of their choices was leading. The Fourth Crusade is the defining example of that phenomenon in the medieval world. A disaster assembled from rational components whose combination produced an outcome that virtually none of its architects had intended, and that altered the trajectory of Byzantine civilization more completely than any external military assault had managed in 8 centuries of trying. It began in 1199, when Pope Innocent III called a new crusade to recover Jerusalem, which Saladin had retaken in 1187 after the catastrophic Christian defeat at the Horns of Hattin. The crusade leadership, drawing on the lessons of previous overland campaigns that had consumed enormous resources crossing Byzantine and Turkish territory, arranged to transport the army by sea, a strategically sensible decision that required contracting with Venice for the ships and provisions the army would need. The Venetians, under their elderly but formidably capable Doge Enrico Dandolo, agreed to provide transport for a specified number of soldiers at a specified price. When the army assembled at Venice in 1202, it numbered substantially fewer men than the leaders had promised, leaving an unpayable debt that the impoverished crusaders had no means of settling. That gap between what had been promised and what had arrived was the first link in the chain. Dandolo proposed a solution. The crusaders could work off their debt by helping Venice recover the city of Zara, a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast that had placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary, a fellow Catholic monarch, and whose commercial competition Venice had been resenting for years. The crusaders agreed, sailed to Zara, and sacked it, and were promptly excommunicated by the Pope for attacking a city full of Christians. They were still technically excommunicated when the next link in the chain arrived in the form of a Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos, whose father Isaac II had been deposed and blinded by his own brother in another of the palace coups that had been consuming Byzantine political energy with depressing regularity since Manuel I's death. Young Alexios appeared at the Crusader camp with a proposition whose attractiveness was inversely proportional to its realism: help him restore his father to the Byzantine throne. He promised, and he would pay the Crusaders' debt to Venice in full, provide provisions and military support for the crusade in Egypt, submit the Orthodox Church to papal authority, and participate personally in the campaign to recover Jerusalem. He was a deposed prince with no resources, promising things that even a legitimately ruling Byzantine emperor would have struggled to deliver. The crusade leadership accepted his offer anyway, partly because the debt was real and the provisions were genuinely needed, partly because the opportunity to establish a friendly emperor in Constantinople held obvious strategic appeal, and partly because Dandolo, who had his own complex history with Byzantium and his own clear vision of what Venetian commercial interests required. Understood exactly where this chain was going, even if others did not. The crusading fleet sailed to Constantinople in 1203. The Byzantine garrison, faced with a Western army on its landward walls and a Western fleet in its harbour simultaneously, offered less resistance than the city's 11th century record of successful defence might have led anyone to expect. Alexios's father was restored. Alexios himself was crowned co-emperor. Then the promised payments failed to materialise. Not because Alexios was dishonest, but because there was simply no money. The empire had been bled by decades of mismanagement, and the treasury that Basil II had filled to overflowing in 1025 was a memory that bore no relationship to the fiscal reality of 1203. The new emperor, unable to deliver what his promises had required, faced growing popular fury in Constantinople over the presence of the Latin army camped outside the walls and the concessions to Rome that his arrangement had implied. A palace coup removed him. A new emperor hostile to the Latins took power. The Crusaders camped outside the walls of a city that had failed to pay them and had just become actively hostile, made the decision that transformed a failed diplomatic arrangement into a civilizational catastrophe. They attacked Constantinople directly. In April of 1204, for the first time in the city's 874-year history, its walls were breached, not by Persians or Arabs or Bulgarians or Turks, but by Western Christians, Latin Catholics who were, in the formal theological sense, co-religionists of the Greek Orthodox people whose city they proceeded to sack for 3 consecutive days. The sack was comprehensive in its destruction and its looting, moving through centuries of accumulated wealth with the systematic thoroughness of soldiers who understood they might never have this opportunity again. Libraries were burned. Churches were stripped of their gold and silver and jewelled reliquaries. The great bronze horses that had stood at the hippodrome since ancient times, sculptures of such technical quality that no craftsman in the medieval world could have cast them, were shipped to Venice, where they were mounted above the portal of the Basilica of San Marco, where they remain today as silent and permanent evidence of what was taken and where it went. The Latin Empire of Constantinople that the Crusaders established lasted 57 years, never achieved stability, never won genuine acceptance from the Greek population it nominally governed, and never extended its effective control much beyond the city and its immediate surroundings. The Byzantine ruling class fled to 3 successor states: the Empire of Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia, the Despotate of Epirus in northwestern Greece, and the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. Of these, Nicaea proved the most capable and the most determined, preserving the institutional traditions of the empire in exile with the focused intention of a state that had never accepted its displacement as permanent, and that spent 57 years preparing for the moment when it would not have to. The reconquest of Constantinople on the 25th of July, 1261, did not happen the way anyone had planned or imagined. Michael Palaiologos, the leading general and effective ruler of the Nicaean Empire, had been manoeuvring toward the moment for years, building alliances, negotiating with Genoa for naval support in exchange for the same kind of sweeping commercial privileges that Alexios I had once granted Venice, preparing the military and diplomatic ground for an assault on a city that the Latin Empire had never managed to defend with any real competence. What actually happened was considerably less dramatic than a planned assault, and considerably more characteristic of how Byzantine history tended to work at its most consequential moments. A Byzantine commander named Alexios Strategopoulos, leading a reconnaissance force that had no orders to attempt the city, discovered that most of the Latin garrison had sailed away on a military expedition, leaving the walls thinly manned. He moved immediately, entering through a postern gate in the night, and by morning the city was Byzantine again with almost no fighting. The Latin emperor fled by ship. Michael entered Constantinople through the Golden Gate, the ceremonial entrance on the southern wall, reserved for triumphal processions since Constantine's day, and walked the length of the city to the Hagia Sophia for the liturgy of thanksgiving. He wept. According to the chronicles, most of those with him wept. The empire had been in exile for 57 years, and its ancient capital was home again. That the recovery came through a night operation by a commander acting beyond his orders rather than through the planned campaign that Michael had been building toward was the kind of historical accident that makes clean narratives impossible. And that captures something true about how the medieval world actually operated beneath the surface of its official accounts. The empire that Michael VIII Palaiologos restored was a ghost of what had been lost. And both he and his successors understood that with uncomfortable clarity, the Latin occupation had been 6 decades of economic extraction and cultural disruption that had reorganized Constantinople's commercial life in ways that Byzantine governance could not simply reverse by reoccupying the city. The genius, who had provided the naval support that made the reconquest possible and who expected substantial compensation for that service, were granted the suburb of Galata directly across the Golden Horn, where they established what amounted to an independent commercial republic with its own walls, its own courts, and its own customs administration. Byzantine customs revenue declined sharply as trade that should have passed through imperial hands moved instead through Genoese brokers operating from a position of structural advantage that the reconquest had actually strengthened rather than reduced. The Venetians, humiliated by the loss of their privileged position, became actively hostile, and the naval rivalry between Venice and Genoa that played out in Byzantine waters treated the empire less as a sovereign power to be negotiated with, and more as a commercial theatre in which Italian city-states pursued their own agendas with the confident freedom of parties who understood they were more economically essential to Constantinople than Constantinople was to them. The empire was not merely weakened, it was becoming a client of the commercial networks that had once been its servants, and the process was far enough advanced by 1261 that no political decision available to the Palaiologian emperors could reverse it. The political situation was equally constrained by forces that the dynasty's longevity. It would rule Constantinople until the city's final fall in 1453. The longest reigning dynasty in Byzantine history could not overcome through mere persistence. In the west, the Balkans were contested by Bulgaria, Serbia, and various Latin principalities that had survived from the Crusader period, and that the reconstituted empire lacked the military capacity to simply absorb or eliminate. In the east, the Anatolian frontier that the Nicaean Empire had defended with genuine effectiveness was immediately under pressure from Turkish principalities that emerged from the collapse of the Seljuk Sultanate after the Mongol invasions of the mid-13th century. These principalities, small, aggressive, motivated by a frontier warrior culture that combined Islamic religious conviction with the organizational energy of states young enough to still believe in their own futures, pressed against Byzantine Anatolia with a persistence that the depleted imperial military could not consistently resist. Byzantine cities fell one by one across the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Prusa in 1326, Nicaea itself, the city that had preserved the empire through its exile, in 1331, Nicomedia in 1337. The heartland of Byzantine civilization in Asia was gone within a human lifetime of the triumphant reconquest of Constantinople. What remained was the city, a scattering of territories in the Balkans, and the Peloponnese, a fragment of an empire maintaining the full ceremonial apparatus of universal Roman sovereignty, with a determination that its critics found delusional and its admirers found magnificent. And that was probably both simultaneously. The Ottoman state that emerged from this landscape of competing Turkish principalities was distinguished from its neighbours less by its initial size. It began as a small frontier principality under Osman I in the borderlands of northwestern Anatolia, than by the organizational intelligence and institutional continuity that its early rulers brought to the particular opportunities that the frontier between the declining Byzantine world and the fractured post-Seljuk Turkish world provided. The Hesychast controversy, which consumed Byzantine intellectual and theological energy across the middle decades of the 14th century in arguments about whether the divine light, visible to contemplative monks, was created or uncreated, was not a distraction from the political crisis in any simple sense. It was political life, as Byzantine civilization understood political life, conducted through the medium of theology, because theology was where the fundamental questions about legitimacy, authority, and the proper relationship between human beings and divine order were argued in that culture. But the spectacle of an empire losing territory annually, while its finest minds debated the metaphysics of mystical illumination, has a quality that even sympathetic historians find difficult to present without a certain pathos. When the Ottomans crossed into Europe in 1354, establishing a foothold at Gallipoli that an earthquake had conveniently opened for them by damaging the Byzantine fortifications, the endgame had begun. Adrianople fell in 1369 and became the Ottoman capital, placing the empire's operational base just across the frontier from Constantinople itself. The city was an island in an Ottoman sea, and had been effectively so for 2 generations before anyone formally acknowledged what that meant. In the winter of 1452, Sultan Mehmed II, 21 years old, possessed of an intelligence that his contemporaries recognized immediately and that his ambitions made impossible to ignore, began construction of a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from an existing Ottoman fortification on the Asian side. Together, the 2 structures gave the Ottomans complete control of the strait, cutting Constantinople off from the Black Sea and from the grain ships and supply vessels that had sustained it for 11 centuries. The message required no translation. Mehmed had been planning the final siege since his accession, had commissioned Hungarian engineers to cast enormous bronze cannon capable of projecting stone balls of unprecedented size against walls that had never been successfully breached by direct assault, and had assembled an army that contemporary estimates placed at somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 soldiers, facing a city whose total available defenders numbered perhaps 7,000, including several hundred Venetian and Genoese volunteers who had chosen to remain when the final crisis arrived. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, had spent his 4 years on the throne, organizing the defense with the resources available to him, and without any of the self-deception that might have made the situation more comfortable. He had written to potential allies in the West, knowing the responses would be inadequate. He had maintained the ceremonial dignity of a ruler commanding an empire, when the territory he actually commanded was a single city. He stretched his available defenders along miles of walls built to accommodate a garrison many times their number, allocating the most experienced soldiers to the most vulnerable sections with the careful arithmetic of a commander who understood that he had no margin for error and very little margin for anything else. The siege began formally on the 6th of April, 1453. Mehmed's largest cannon, the greatest, reportedly requiring 60 oxen and 400 men to move, and capable of firing only 7 times per day because it needed hours to cool between shots, created breaches in the Theodosian walls that the defenders repaired each night with whatever materials they could find: barrels of earth, wooden frameworks, rubble packed and tamped down against the collapsed stone, with the desperate ingenuity of people who understood that the walls were the only thing standing between the city and its end. The defence of the harbour walls was complicated by an Ottoman tactical innovation of extraordinary audacity. Mehmed had wooden rollers laid along a hillside north of the Golden Horn, and used them to drag a significant portion of his fleet overland from the Bosphorus into the Golden Horn itself, bypassing the great chain that the Byzantines had stretched across the harbour entrance to keep the Ottoman navy out. Suddenly Constantinople faced a naval threat on the side it had considered secure, and defenders who were already stretched beyond any reasonable margin had to be redistributed to cover the sea walls as well. The chain had been a cornerstone of Byzantine harbour defence for centuries. The overland manoeuvre that rendered it irrelevant in an afternoon was one of the great feats of medieval military engineering, and it demonstrated with brutal clarity the quality of the mind Mehmed commanded. For 53 days the defence held, a performance that deserves considerably more recognition than it typically receives. Given the disproportion of forces involved and the technological advantage that Mehmed's cannon represented against fortifications designed for a world that had not yet imagined artillery at that scale, in the early hours of the 29th of May, 1453, after a final liturgy in the Hagia Sophia that contemporary accounts describe as attended by virtually the entire remaining population of the city, Orthodox and Latin, civilian and soldier, people who had been theologically at odds for decades standing together in the candlelight of a church that had witnessed 11 centuries of Byzantine history. The last assault began. The initial wave of irregular fighters battered the breach in the Theodosian walls. They were followed by Anatolian infantry. The defence held for 2 hours. Then a small gate called the Kirka Porta, used for sortie operations and apparently left inadequately secured in the chaos of the night assault, was discovered by Ottoman soldiers who poured through it into the space between the inner and outer walls. At roughly the same moment, the great Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani, who had been the single most effective organiser of the defence across the entire siege, was wounded seriously enough that he asked to be carried from the walls. Constantine XI begged him to stay. He did not stay. When the defenders saw Ottoman flags appearing within the wall system and saw their commander being carried away, the resistance at the critical section collapsed. Ottoman soldiers poured through the breach in numbers that nothing could stop. Constantine Xi Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor, is reported to have removed his imperial regalia so that he could not be identified as the man worth capturing rather than killing, and died fighting in the press at the walls. His body was never definitively identified. The empire that had called itself Roman for 11 centuries ended in an anonymous act of ordinary courage. Its last ruler indistinguishable in death from the soldiers who had stood beside him. What Byzantium left behind was not ruins in the conventional sense that empires leave ruins. It left things that still function, still speak, still shape the world that outlived it. The scholars who fled Constantinople in the decades before and after 1453 carried manuscripts into Italy that fed the Renaissance with Greek texts. Plato, Aristotle, the tragedians, the physicians, that Western Europe had known only partially or not at all. The Corpus Juris Civilis that Justinian's scholars compiled in the 6th century became the foundation of the legal systems governing billions of people across France, Italy, Germany, Spain, and their global derivatives, the Orthodox churches of Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece carry institutional and cultural inheritance from Constantinople that has shaped national identities still entirely active in the 21st century. The Hagia Sophia, church for nearly 1,000 years, mosque for 5 centuries, museum, mosque again, stands in Istanbul as one of the longest continuously functioning architectural monuments in human history, its 6th century dome still holding, its mosaics still catching light through windows that Anthemius and Isidore placed precisely to achieve exactly that effect 15 centuries ago. The city on the Bosphorus is now Istanbul, home to 17 million people. The Golden Horn still catching morning light in the way that Constantine recognized when he chose the site. The wheel has turned many times since the last liturgy echoed through the Hagia Sophia on that May morning. But Byzantium, improbably, stubbornly, magnificently, remains among the things that turning did not erase.